How do Mercedes diesels compare with other 80s diesels? I think that some of you who remember the 80s think about other diesels sometimes, like the Volkswagen diesel, the Volvo diesel, the GM 5.7 diesel, the Ford Navistar 6.9 and 7.3 diesel, eventually the Cummins diesel. There were some other vehicles too that had diesel engines, like the Chevy Chevette or the Chevy Celebrity or the International Scout with its Nissan turbo diesel, or even the extremely rare 1979 Dodge D150 with the Mitsubishi diesel, or the even rarer Eagle AMC Eagle wagon that had a do-it-yourself diesel engine, where you'd buy a diesel engine from AMC and install the whole thing in an AMC Eagle. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about how other diesels compared to Mercedes diesels from the 1980s. And there's a reason why there are so many remaining Mercedes diesels, and we're going to learn why in this video. The first diesel that I decided to compare the Mercedes 616 and 617 to was the Volvo inline 6 diesel that was used in the 240 and the 740. And in the 740, this was a turbocharged engine, whereas in the 240, it was just a plain old wheezy inline 6 with 80 horsepower. Now, this engine was sourced from Volkswagen, and Volkswagen used it in their little utility truck that they had. I can't remember what it was called, but they had a truck that you could buy that was significantly larger than a Volkswagen van. Now, it was still smaller than, let's say, a Chevy G20 or a Ford Econoline, but it had similar cargo capacity, and it was a large, boxy, water-cooled van that had this 2.4-liter inline 6 in it. And these are used all over the world. They were the van you bought when you couldn't afford a Mercedes T1 Transporter. They were basically the poor working man's version of the Mercedes. And I never really thought they were that good, but they were all over the place in Lebanon. So how bad could they really be, right? Now, these diesel engines that were used in Volvos had a couple of weak points that Mercedes didn't ever have. First of all, they had not one, but two timing belts, because when I look at an engine, I just think to myself, man, how fun would it be if there was a front timing belt for the cam and then a rear one for the injection pump? If I remember right, there were two of these things. And because of that, it was really easy to mess up injection pump timing and cam timing and have to deal with both problems at the same time. And it just sounds like a routine maintenance nightmare. And by the way, there were several other manufacturers that used this goofy, stupid setup. So putting a timing belt in a diesel is the equivalent of putting a carton of eggs on top of the transmission of a Mack truck. Eventually, the vibrations are just going to break all the eggs. BMW did this, and Datsun did this in the Maxima. And while the Datsun diesels weren't that bad, they still had a timing belt-driven injection pump, or a belt-driven injection pump. The BMW diesels, while they were curious and interesting and were also installed in Lincoln Mark V's of the era, they made a few thousand Lincoln Mark V's with this engine. The truth was that the BMW engine was also an anemic piece of junk, and it was similar capacity to the Volvo, and it may have even been the same engine. I actually don't know. It could be the same engine, but because I can't see one of these, I can't tell. But BMW always distinctively branded their engine in the 524 TD as their engine. And it was a similar capacity and exterior design dimensioned engine to the Volvo engine. So we can't be sure. Or can we? We do know one thing. There aren't many of them on the road today. And even 20 years ago, there were not many of them on the road. So this is automatically an inferior engine. Now, let's talk about the Volkswagen diesel engine. Volkswagen decided that the best place to stick a diesel was in a cheap car, because cheap cars need to get good fuel economy. If you're driving around a Lincoln Mark V, do you really need to get 30 miles per gallon? I'm just curious. Do you? The entire ploy behind Volkswagen was that they needed an engine that provided much better fuel economy than the flat four and the Beetle to get customers out of Beetles. And really, like, as much as we love Volkswagen Beetles, they're not great cars. I would rather drive a Rabbit than a Beetle. But the Rabbit had some flaws of its own. So first of all, the 1.5 and eventually 1.6 liter diesel that was used in the Rabbit and the Jetta and the Passat and the Quantum and the Dasher and all these crappy little Volkswagens that fell apart, except for the Caddy pickup. You can easily find a Volkswagen Caddy today. There are plenty of them out there. People just loved those things. Those cars were designed to fall apart around their engines, with the engine not too far after. But the little Volkswagen diesel with its aluminum head and timing belt, again, back to the timing belt, was not as strong as the Mercedes engine. And although it had less horsepower because the Volkswagen was so light, it could easily keep up with traffic and could easily perform, you know, all the duties you needed. So if you're okay driving around in a front-wheel drive barrel like a Rabbit hatchback from the 80s, and I still see some of these. There are still people driving these things. There's one guy that I see driving these on US 1. He's driving like a silver blue 81 Rabbit diesel. Props to this guy. This guy's my hero. Not the most comfortable car. Cheap seats, cheap dashboards, not a lot of rust proofing, but they met the fulfillment of being a good economy car. I'm convinced if the Volkswagens were built to a higher standard, especially the ones built in the United States at the old AMC factory somewhere in the Rust Belt of Pennsylvania, I'm convinced more of them would still be here because they were simple enough to repair and maintain. Everybody loves a simple car. Now, a third diesel that we are going to look at, we're going to change gears a little bit, the International 6.9 and 7.3. Now, these are truck engines. You couldn't fit one of these in any passenger car, except maybe a big old Cadillac or something. They were heavy. I pulled a lot of these things out. At the time, their main competition was the 6.2 GM diesel, which they absolutely blew out of the water. The 6.9 was a very overbuilt engine, but early 6.9s had a tendency to break their cylinder heads. They'd just crack the heads or lose their head gaskets. Also, the standardized injection pumps, which were, again, rotary pumps. Are you guys seeing a theme here? Everybody used a rotary pump, except Mercedes. Kind of depressing. All of these trucks had problems with their pumps and their heads eventually. They were worked to death. People just beat on them. You know, we never saw clean, nice, perfect F-350s come into our shop. They were always tired. I mean, the ones that always ran the best were the fleet maintained ones, but they were always rusty and beat to death because they were fleet trucks. So they'd get oil changes every 3,000 miles, but nobody would ever rust proof them. You know, they had 500,000 miles on them. They ran flawlessly, but they had been hit in all four corners. You know, it was just, it's a rough life for a vehicle. And so these vehicles are meant to work hard. And so I think more of them would be out here if they weren't worked to death. Now, another diesel that I want to compare these to is probably the best one of all of them. The only one that I think really holds a candle to the Mercedes diesel, and that was the Peugeot diesel. And eventually, Peugeot had these X series engines. They were known as XD and then eventually XUD. And these engines were tough. They initially started out in the 504, which was the most beautiful car ever brought to the United States. It was not a Mercedes or a Saab. It had this little hunch in the back. It had a very distinctive look, but I always thought the Peugeot 504 was a brilliant car. And they had a very solid cast iron head, mechanically injected pushrod diesel engine that was used up until 1978. And then they started doing goofy things with the last 504s and the 505s, like putting on aluminum heads and adding an electronic component to the injection pump and the injection process that could make the car not run well or sometimes not run at all. And I don't have a really good understanding of Peugeot diesel, so I'm looking for maybe some correction about this in the comments from some of you who might be les connaisseurs de la moteur diesel Peugeot. But I don't think that these engines were bad. I just don't think they were as good as Mercedes engines. Now, Mercedes took a page from everybody who made a diesel engine. What they did was they made a less durable engine. That's for the OM 601, which was okay, but not as rebuildable as the 616 came from. It's where the 602 diesel came from as well. Now, the 602 is an NA diesel, such as in the 190D 2.5, is an excellent engine. Problem was when you try to turbocharge it, a lot of carbon, a lot of wear and tear, a lot of heat, a lot of head gasket failures. And finally, the 603, and we know everybody has a story about their 603 having a major problem. You know, most of us have no stories about our 617 turbo diesel having a major problem unless we really, really, really did something stupid. So these engines in the Peugeots were probably the most, I'd say the closest thing to a reliable passenger car diesel. But what happened to them? Well, Peugeot left the United States. They already did not have a great dealership network. After they left, no more parts, eventually no more service, eventually no more support for the cars. And once support went away, Peugeots became undesirable because most people look at a car like that, they say, I can't get this serviced, what am I going to do? Sell it for $500 on Craigslist when it is a simple problem. I knew years ago in like 2003 when I was in high school, my white trash neighbors bought a $300 Peugeot 505 with a gas engine. And they had that and a Triumph TR7 and a AMC Eagle, and the tools they knew how to use best were a hammer and a bigger hammer. They couldn't fix anything, so they'd buy these cars, try to fix them. They'd never fix them. They'd just sit and deteriorate in front of the house. And then eventually they get hauled off to the scrapyard. And so that's the story of many a Peugeot, gas or diesel. Now, there's some other honorable mentions that I didn't bring up in here that I probably should have discussed. Chevrolet made a 4.3 liter diesel V6, or I should say Oldsmobile made a diesel V6, 4.3 liters. That was a good engine. They did not sell a lot of them. Ford put a Mazda diesel in the Ranger, and that was a decent engine. They just didn't sell a lot of them, but they do still exist. Mitsubishi had available diesel products, and their diesels were okay too. I think they were pushrod diesels. There's nothing wrong with a little pushrod diesel in a small pickup truck. Isuzu had their own little diesels too that were used in their pickups and in the Isuzu Trooper. And to be honest, the Isuzu engine was a good engine, but it still had a timing belt and a rotary injection pump. There used to be a man who had an upholstery shop here in Titusville that was still driving around a diesel pup. And that meant one thing, the car was still pretty serviceable. It was sort of like a Volkswagen diesel. It had some shortcuts taken, but all of them were surmountable. Another great little diesel that I like to think of is the Toyota Corolla diesel, although there are almost none left. These were made at 85 and 86, and they're pretty much gone. The Jeep Cherokee diesel, which had a Renault J1S turbo diesel, which was, well, first it was naturally aspirated, then it was a turbo diesel. And yes, this engine was an afterthought. It had an aluminum block. No way, guys. Sorry. Didn't work. These were put in, curiously, in the Winnebago Lachero. So you had a 5,500-pound RV being pulled around by a naturally aspirated 2-liter, 55-horsepower diesel engine. Volkswagen also installed their engine in the Vanagon, which was another terrible idea because the Vanagon was the antithesis of aerodynamic. And the 1.6 liter Volkswagen engine, maybe on a good day, was good for 65 miles an hour. So if you guys thought the 50s were done and gone, the 80s outdid them handsomely, because the only car that was slower than a Volkswagen diesel Vanagon would probably be a Mercedes 170 DA with the old pushrod OM636. And when they started putting the 55 horsepower OM621 in those cars, they were significantly faster than the Vanagon. This is a car from the 50s. I hope you guys enjoyed this lovely video about Mercedes diesels and how well they stacked up, but really the truth is they were just head and shoulders above all other cars, and often head and shoulders above, actually I would say they were head and shoulders above gas engines too. And other diesels just couldn't compete. And if they had been able to compete and the cars were just as good, because remember Mercedes engineered the whole car to a high standard, not just the engine, they would still be here. Only the Mercedes are the ones that are really left in abundance. I'll see you guys in the future.